we assumed that if gross domestic product was increasing in our country, we were getting happier. And then somebody decided to actually look. And it turns out that particularly in developed countries, as nations get wealthier, happiness either flatlines or it goes down. And so people began to say, what then does matter? If it is not simply societal wealth, what are the conditions that make for a good life?
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Lily Rabinoff-Goldman. I'm president and CEO of JCC Greater Boston. Now, more than ever, we are eager to hear from Dr. Waldinger as he shares the answer to the question, what makes for a happy and fulfilling life? His TED Talk about what makes a good life has been viewed more than 45 million times and is one of the 10 most watched TED Talks ever. Pretty good. And I am going to hand things over to him. So thank you all for being here. Dr. Bob Waldinger.
Yeah, okay. I'm very glad to be here. So I'm sort of billed as studying happiness, but I never thought of myself as a happiness researcher because it wasn't until about 20 years ago that people took the study of happiness seriously. Because we assumed that if gross domestic product was increasing in our country, we were getting happier. And then somebody decided to actually look. And it turns out that particularly in developed countries, as nations get wealthier, happiness either flatlines or it goes down. And so people began to say, what then does matter? If it is not simply societal wealth, what are the conditions that make for a good life? And now people study it quite seriously. And you may know that the United Nations publishes a World Happiness Report every year. You can download the latest one, the UN Happiness Report. And what they do is they send scientists all over the world every year and ask people from all walks of life, all ages, all cultures, what are the essential things that you need to have a good life? So in fact, what they do say is that people do need their material needs met. So yes, money is important, but what that means, and they've studied this, is that once we get our basic needs met, that's all we need in terms of happiness. So until we have food security and a place to live and access to health care and can educate our children, until we have the money to do those things, we are much less happy. And so in 2017, they did a study of this and found that in the US, on average, $75,000 a year household income was about what people needed to have those basic needs met. And that then you could make $75 million a year and you're not significantly happier. So then what, in addition, makes a difference? What makes people feel that they have a good life? All right, these will not surprise you. People feel they need social support. They feel they need to be able to expect to have healthy lives, and that does mean access to decent health care. They need the freedom to make big life choices. And as we know, that varies tremendously depending on where you live in the world, maybe even where you live in this country these days. They also need opportunities to be generous. And this was one of the surprises, that people uniformly say they need opportunities to give not just money, but they need to be able to give of their time, of their expertise, of their energy in order to feel that life is meaningful. And finally, they need to be able to trust both their neighbors and their governments. Again, that varies tremendously, but we won't go there tonight. So then, when we ask young people who are starting out in their careers, what are you going to prioritize in order to be happy, in order to have a good life? They did a survey in 2017 of millennials and asked this question, and over 80% of 20-somethings said that what they needed to have a good life was they needed to become rich. And over half of those same young adults said that they needed to become famous in order to feel like life was good. And if you think about it, fame is a very strange goal. To have lots of people know who you are, but really not know you at all. And finally, more than half, said that they needed to achieve a great deal at work. So this is a disconnect, right? That wealth and fame and high achievement at work, they're not part of what people say in the UN Happiness Report year after year, that they need to have a good life. So the question is, what is responsible for that disconnect between what young adults think they're going to want and what people say actually works when it comes to having a good life? A lot of this seems to have to do with the culture that we live in, that we are surrounded by and don't even notice. All of the messages that we get all day long from media about what's supposed to make us happy. You know, if you buy a certain brand of car, you're going to be happy. If you serve a certain brand of pasta at your family dinners, the dinners will be blissful, right? If you use a certain face cream, you'll never look old. Maybe you'll never get old, right? You know, and we chuckle about this because we know how silly it is, and yet these are the messages that bombard us all day long, all right? So that what's supposed to be a good life gets defined for us by the culture. And we define it for each other, now more than ever on social media. So I pulled this photo from Facebook. It's one of the typical photos we post for each other. You know, imagine, you know, if you were coming from outer space and your only source of information about human beings was social media, you would think we were always at wild parties and on great beaches, and we were always about to dig into magnificent plates of food, right? And even again, though you're all smiling, you all see how silly this is, we curate our lives for each other. We don't show the messy parts. And what it does is it leaves many of us feeling like everybody has life figured out except me. One of my teachers put it this way. She said, we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. You know, the me who wakes up some mornings feeling pretty good, but some mornings feeling cranky, feeling lost, feeling annoyed with everything. I don't post those pictures, right? Nobody does. But it leaves us with the sense that the good life is elsewhere and that I'm not having it. The other thing is that the media give us messages all day long about what we're supposed to look like. So I pulled this, right? I pulled this, it's a typical underwear ad, and I deliberately chose a man's body because women's bodies are much more often exploited for these purposes, right? When was the last time that the ad agencies showed us an ad like this, right? You know? And again, we understand the absurdity of of this contrast, right? And yet, it's what we do all day long. It's what we receive. It's what the ad agencies show us. And imagine being young and looking at these and thinking about what you're supposed to look like and whether or not you fit into the human race, right? So this has major consequences for all of us, but particularly for young people. All right, so how do we really study life? What really happens to people as they go through their lives? Well, most of what we know about human life, we know from asking people to remember the past. And that's a perfectly good way to study life, except that, as you know, our memories are full of holes. I mean, what did you have for dinner a year ago tonight? I mean, unless it was a special night, you have no idea. So much comes into our minds and then leaves again, and needs to, in order to make room. But some of the things that we forget turn out to be more important than we realize, right? The other thing is that our memories are creative. So cognitive science shows us that the very act of calling up a memory changes that memory. Now imagine the problems for people who rely on eyewitness testimony in courts of law. I mean, this is a huge issue. So all of that means that simply relying on people to remember their own pasts leaves us without adequate information about human life. So I'm making the case for why I've spent the last 20 years doing what I do. The other mistake that we researchers often make is we do what are called snapshot studies. So let's say I want to study how diabetes, how that illness progresses over the lifespan. Well, I could take a group of 10-year-olds today with diabetes and a group of 20-year-olds, a group of 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds, et cetera. And I can then assume I know what diabetes looks like as people go through life. But that turns out to be a trap, that we can end up making assumptions that aren't true. The best way I know to explain this is through a comment by a congressman. Some of you may remember this name, Claude Pepper from the state of Florida. He once quipped, he said, "When I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish." He was doing a snapshot study, right? So you can end up making really wrong assumptions about what's happening as people go through their lives. All right, again, explaining why I do what I do. So the Harvard study of adult development, as Lily told you, is, as far as we know, the longest study of the same human beings that's ever been done. It actually began as two separate studies. Both began in the year 1938 in the city of Boston. One was a group of Harvard College undergraduate students, sophomores, 19-year-olds, who were thought by their deans to be fine, upstanding specimens, and it was meant to be a study of normal development from adolescence to young adulthood. So of course, if you want to study normal development, you study all white guys from Harvard, right? I mean, it is the most politically incorrect sample you could possibly have, and we're constantly having to explain to NIH why they should still fund us. The other study was begun at Harvard Law School by Sheldon Gluck and Eleanor Gluck. They were interested in juvenile delinquency, and so they chose boys of middle school age from Boston's poorest families, and not just the poorest families, but the most troubled families. So many families, most families were known on average to 5 social service agencies in the city of Boston in 1938 for domestic violence, severe parental mental illness, physical illness, extreme poverty. They were interested in how some children born into such terrible circumstances managed to stay on good developmental paths, managed to stay out of trouble and do well. So they were also interested in thriving. And both of those studies, because of their interest in thriving, were unusual at the time. Most of what we study is what goes wrong in human development, understandably, because we want to be able to help when things are not right. But very, very few studies had been done about what goes right in development. What are the conditions of thriving for young people? So we started with 724 young men, and then eventually we included spouses, and almost all of these young men married. And then eventually we included all their children, more than half of whom are women. So we have quite a gender balanced group, but everybody is white. And that is the biggest limitation of this study. And fortunately, one of my colleagues told me to look up the demographics of the city of Boston in 1938. It was 97.4% white, because the waves of immigration of people of color came to Boston after World War II. So what that means is tonight, as I present findings to you from our study, I'm only going to present those findings that are true for more diverse groups, not just for our group of white families, okay? And if there are findings that aren't true for larger groups, more diverse groups, I'll say something about that. Because it's really important not to assume that research is inclusive enough to draw conclusions about life in general, unless we make a specific effort to do that. And so we've spent a lot of time looking at other studies of more diverse groups to see what they find. All right, when we began the study, these young men were examined. They had long medical exams, psychiatric exams. We went to their homes and we sat down with their parents and sometimes their grandparents. Many of these were in tenements with no hot and cold running water for the inner city kids. They traveled all over the country to the homes of the Harvard undergraduates and asked the parents in detail about things like parenting style. There were wonderful detailed notes about what was being served for dinner and what the decor was like in the home. And then all of these young men were followed. They were studied again and again by my predecessors. The Harvard men were of an age to go to World War II. And so almost all went and served in the war. Almost all came back. The inner city men were on average 9 years younger, so they were not eligible to go to World War II. But then they all grew up and became doctors, lawyers, factory workers. John F. Kennedy was part of the Harvard sample. Ben Bradley, longtime editor of the Washington Post. We recently learned that the Boston Strangler was one of the inner city boys. But most of these people were not famous, they were not infamous, they were just living their lives. And they were allowing us to study them. It was an enormous gift that they gave to us year after year to allow themselves to be part of this study. And then eventually, as they grew older, we studied aging and retirement. And of course, we're still studying their children. So what have we studied? Well, we've studied the great big domains of human life: mental health, physical health. For the Harvard men, World War II experiences. My predecessors were prescient. They asked important questions about what we now know is PTSD, but it wasn't defined that way in 1946 when they came back from the war. Many of them saw combat. Many of them had PTSD. We studied their work lives. We studied relationships, which you'll hear a lot about tonight, and eventually aging and retirement. So how did we do it? Well, certainly we did ask them to remember the past. We sent them questionnaires every 2 years, checking in on all kinds of aspects of their lives, but we also got their medical records from their doctors. We interviewed them about every 10 years. We went to their homes and sat down with them for 3-4 hour interviews. And eventually, we began to bring new methods in to study the big topics. So, and this is what I love, we began to draw blood for DNA and messenger RNA and telomere length. We began to study cardiovascular responses that were never measurable before, how quickly we calm down using heart rate variability. Sorry, I'm not, am I, that's fine. That's better? Okay, I'm gonna really stay close to this mic here. We've studied biomarkers that have only been developed and understood in the last 10 years, right? And so what I love is the chance to study the same themes using new methods. We brought people into our lab and deliberately stressed them out and then saw how quickly they recovered from stress in order to understand resilience and thriving. So what did we find? Well, we've published hundreds of papers. We just published our 11th book. And the first big finding won't surprise you at all. It's that taking care of our bodies really matters. That taking care of physical health adds years, even decades, to life. And not just living longer, but disability-free life. And that's what we all want. We don't want to just live longer, we want to live healthier. And so what that means is eating a reasonable diet. It means not smoking, not abusing alcohol or drugs. It means getting regular exercise, getting preventive health care. All of that matters. So we found that clearly taking care of our health matters enormously. We, of course, we're not the first study to find this, but our study corroborated what so many other studies have found. But the finding that did surprise us, that we didn't believe at first, was that the people who stayed healthy longer and lived longer were the people who were more connected to other people. That the people who literally saw more people in a given week lived longer, were healthier. The people who had warmer relationships with other people stayed healthier, lived longer. We didn't believe this because it didn't make sense. I mean, yeah, we all pay lip service to the idea that the mind and the body are connected, but how could the quality of your friendships actually get into your body and change your physiology? How could that be possible? How could loneliness break down your health? Well, we've spent the last 10 years in our lab trying to understand how this works. And many other laboratories are working on the same question. And I'll say more about that. So what we find is that the connections between our social lives and our physical health are really powerful. For example, loneliness, being disconnected from others, is as powerful a negative predictor of health as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day, as having untreated high blood pressure, as being obese. The other thing we know is that intimacy helps us live longer, that actually being in an intimate partnership, men live 7 to 17 years longer, women live 5 to 12 years longer. Women will always say that marriage is a better deal for men than for women. But we think it's not just that. We think that women by nature tend to be more connected than men, so they have less of a benefit to get from marriage than the men do. The other thing we know is that broader social networks and more social activity as we age prevent cognitive decline. That the people who are going to experience cognitive decline experience it later, and the pace of it is slower among people who are more socially active, more socially connected. So big protective effects as we age. Now, all that said, as I'm sure you have read about, loneliness now is epidemic in our society. I just pulled this statistic from the Gallup survey, which is one of the good organizations that does this kind of work. And they found in February of last year that when they stopped people on the street and asked, were you lonely yesterday? It's a very specific targeted question. That 17% of adults in the US, so that would work out to 44 million people, said that they were lonely a lot of the previous day. That's huge. And we think that that's an underestimation of how prevalent loneliness is. Some estimates are 1 in 3 at least 1 in 4 people in the US and in developed countries will say that they are lonely a great deal of the time. The loneliest age groups are kind of surprising. Adults under 30. I thought that young people would be among the least lonely, but in fact, it's actually age 16 to 24 that is the loneliest age group. I mean, we all look at these young people and say, they're with their peers, they're having great lives. Turns out it's a time of tremendous disconnection and anxiety and insecurity. And the other thing we've learned is that low-income households have much higher rates of loneliness, and that may have something to do with many people needing to work 2 and even 3 jobs and having no time for social connections. All right, so as I said, as a researcher, we ask the question, how does this work? How do relationships actually change us physically? And the best hypothesis that we have is that it has to do with stress. That we know that loneliness is a stressor. We know that we believe we evolved to be in groups because it's safer to be in groups. It certainly was when we had different predators. And so we know that, for example, we sleep less soundly when we're alone than we do when somebody else is in the house. All of this seems to be hardwired into us. And stress is a normal part of life, right? I mean, I go along and I was in a terrible traffic jam around Mass General Hospital today, and there was a policeman yelling at me because I was in the wrong lane, and I was just enormously stressed. Okay. And I could feel my heart rate go up, and, I'm sure my blood pressure went up. And then I went home and I complained to my wife. And I can literally feel myself calm down. You can feel your body return to equilibrium. And that is what our bodies are meant to do. That stress is not a problem. The fight or flight response is not a problem. It's a normal physiologic response. But then the body is meant to go back to baseline. And what we think happens is that people who are isolated don't ever quite go back to baseline, that they stay in a kind of low-level fight or flight response. And that means higher levels of circulating stress hormones like cortisol, higher levels of chronic inflammation, and inflammation breaks down multiple body systems. We know that people have higher levels of cardiovascular reactivity, more heart disease. They fight off infection less well. So all of that seems to come from chronic stress that never gets relieved. And we believe that relationships, among other things, are stress regulators. So one of the things we get to do in our study is we get to ask the same questions over and over again. So we ask the same 6 questions about marriage. We ask them 8 times over 50 years. And then for each person, we could plot a little graph. And this is the average of 724 couples, right? And what we find, and other studies find this too, is that we are happiest in our partnerships when we first get together. That's not a surprise. That satisfaction goes down when the first child is born, if the couple has kids, and satisfaction goes back up again when the last child leaves home. And this has been found in many different studies. The other thing we're learning now is that satisfaction goes back down again. Let's see. There we are. It goes back down again if children return to live at home. Now, this is a culturally specific finding. So there are many cultures in which it's normal for kids to live at home till they're married, sometimes even after they're married. And so this holds for, Western industrialized nations, Caucasians, by and large, but not for everybody. The other thing we know is that relationships don't have to be smooth all the time to be health promoting, right? So you could imagine that everything has to be wonderful and there can't be any conflict for relationships to give us these benefits. Not true at all. So for example, we brought couples into our laboratory at one point and we asked them to have an argument with each other. And we asked them to pick, we asked them to list the things they normally argued about. So it might be housework, it might be childcare, it might be sex, and we had them list them, and then we asked them to choose one topic and said, would you have a discussion about this for 10 minutes? And we're going to videotape you. And so they did, and they quickly forgot about the video cameras once they started talking, and they just went right to it. And then what we did was we had researchers come in and rate those videotapes for the emotions being expressed by each member of the couple. We thought that the angriest couples were going to be the ones who were more likely to break up or to be less satisfied 5 years later when we checked up on them. It wasn't the case. It turned out that the key to staying together and being more satisfied over the next 5 years was whether our observers could see the expression of respect and affection even when the couple was having an argument. And so what we found was that conflict wasn't the problem. Anger wasn't the problem. It was really whether a couple was able to hold on to their affection and respect for each other, even when they disagreed. That no relationship of significance is without disagreements. All right. Now, one of the things we also got to see as people got older is that we get happier as we get older. Some of you may know this from your own experience, and that in fact, it's very well demonstrated, many studies of tens of thousands of people all over the world. As a species, we get happier. So the question is, how does that work? Well, one of my colleagues, Linda Carstensen at Stanford, studies this. And what she came to understand through some very good studies was that the sense of limited time actually makes us happier. So starting about in our mid-40s, we start getting the realization of, oh, this mortality thing is real. And I'm not going to be the one exception in history. It's really, time is getting shorter. And that rather than making us more depressed, that increasing realization prompts us to make changes that make us happier. So what do? So we pay more attention to what's positive. When we're younger, our brains are biased toward what's negative. I mean, think about, if you get in a job evaluation, 10 pieces of good feedback and 1 piece of slightly negative feedback, the good feedback goes out the window and you dwell on that one little negative thing, right? So we were programmed to do that, it seems, because it's very good to be able to pay attention to what's wrong out there, particularly if you want to be able to anticipate threats. And so we think that there's an evolutionary advantage, a survival advantage, to paying attention to what's wrong, more attention to what's wrong than what's right, okay? But our brains didn't evolve to make us happy. They evolved for us to pass on our genes. And this bias toward the negative makes us less happy. That bias switches around as we get older. So that in fact, as we get older, we pay more attention to what's positive and we remember it longer than we remember the negative. We also remember our pasts more positively. We actually kind of whitewash our childhood memories. There's a bumper sticker that says, "It's never too late to have a happy childhood." And it's really true. And there are good studies of this. We all just kind of whitewash the memories. And that's probably a good thing in terms of contentment as we get older. And we savor the present moment more because as we realize that life is short, we literally stop and smell the roses more than we do when we're younger. So all of that means that as we get older, actually, as long as we keep relatively healthy, that we are more contented. The other thing we get to study is how we use our discretionary income. I told you that wealth doesn't make us happier, but we all have, hopefully, discretionary income, and we study how people use it. So are we happier when we use our extra money to buy things, or are we happier when we use our extra money to pay for experiences? So things like, I don't know, buying a new sport jacket I don't really need, or a new car I don't really need. Experiences like tickets to a soccer game or to a museum or going on a family vacation, right? And what we find, and this is actually a quote from Art Buchwald, the best things in life aren't things. That when we use our discretionary money to pay for experiences, it makes us happier and we stay happier longer than when we pay for material objects. Again, we ask, well, why? How does that work? Well, it turns out that material things just beg for comparison. So if I buy a new fancy flat screen TV, I'm all excited about it, and then I go to my neighbor's house and find out he's got a bigger one, a fancier one. And these kinds of comparisons make us less happy. That we actually know from research that the more frequently we compare ourselves to other people in a given day, the less happy we are. So I put that quote from Teddy Roosevelt up there. Comparison is the thief of joy. And we don't do that as often with experiences. My trip to, this was actually a summer trip. We took our kids to Alaska. And this was a group of people, on our boat who I'd never met before. That experiences are often connected with relationships. We often go with people we know. So my family got a little closer by going on this vacation together, and we often connect with people we don't know. So that's another way in which spending money on experiences makes us happier. All right. We're also kind of bad at predicting what's going to make us happy. And this is particularly evident when it comes to social connection. So I'm going to tell you about a great study that was done in Chicago. You probably know Chicago has a really good commuter rail system. And so they studied commuters in the city of Chicago. And what they did was they assigned people to one of two conditions. So they just, two completely comparable groups. One group was assigned to do what they normally do on their commute, to listen to music, to look at their phone, to do what they normally did. And the other group was assigned to talk to a stranger on the commuter rail. And they asked people in advance, how much do you think you're going to like this? And the people who were assigned to talk to strangers thought they were not going to like it much at all. When everybody got off the train, they asked them again, how do you feel? How much did you like the commute? The people who talked to strangers were significantly happier than the people who did what they normally do every day. It's an example of how we have this reluctance to make connections, and that often once we do make connections, we're much happier that we have done so. Now, with all that said, I'm going to talk about the trends in our culture, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Bowling Alone is the title of a book by Robert Putnam. He's a political scientist at Harvard, and he wrote this book in the 1980s. And what Putnam did was he surveyed how much we all as a society invest in what he called social capital. And what he meant by that was, how much do we invest in other people? How much do we join clubs? How much do we go to temples and churches? How much do we volunteer in the community? How much do we invite people over? How often do we eat together as a family? And what he found was that starting in the 1950s, all of those things went down dramatically until he studied them in the 1980s. And then Putnam went back in the early 2000s and asked the same questions again, and he found that everything had gotten significantly worse. So fewer people weren't joining clubs as often, fewer family dinners, And we know that families eating together regularly is tremendously impactful for family cohesion, for child development, for how children do in school even. Having friends over, much less common, again in the early 2000s. The other thing Putnam asked people was, is there anybody you can talk to about personal matters? Anybody in the world? And in the 1980s, 12% of people said no, there wasn't anybody. In the early 2000s, 1 in 4 people in the US said there was nobody they could talk to about personal matters. All right, so what's happening here? Well, as I said, this started in the 1950s, and the digital revolution hadn't happened yet. But what we think has happened is that the digital revolution and our addiction to these wonderful screens has accelerated this tendency toward isolation. You know, I think about my wife and I coming down in the morning for breakfast, and she's checking her email, and I'm scrolling through the news on my phone. I realize we're not even looking at each other. We're certainly not talking to each other. And you probably see people at restaurants where people are sitting around a table, but everybody's on their phone, and sometimes they're texting each other around the table, but they're not looking at each other, they're not talking. So it seems that the digital revolution has accelerated these trends. Similarly, it takes us away from the natural world. This is an iconic photo that was, I think, in the New York Times. You see this man completely oblivious on his phone, oblivious to what's happening in front of him. And I'm sure you've seen people in beautiful settings just glued to their screens, right? The other thing we talk about a lot is our kids. And we talk about, well, what's going to happen to all of them? But the real question is, what are we doing? What are we modeling for kids and grandkids? Because they do what we do. And what we're coming to understand is that it's very possible to limit these technologies, to limit exposure to these technologies. We just have to be quite intentional about it. The other thing we've begun to learn about is loneliness at work. The Gallup organization does very good wide surveys, and they surveyed 15 million workers. And one of their primary questions, this was in 2018, they asked, do you have a best friend at work? And what they meant was, is there anybody at work you can talk to about your personal life? And what they found was that the people who said, yes, I have a best friend at work, they were better at their jobs, better at engaging customers, did better work. They were less likely to get injured on the job. They were less likely to leave that job for what they thought was a better opportunity. So how many people had a best friend at work? 30% of those 15 million workers. All right? And then they asked the 70% who didn't have a best friend at work, how engaged do you feel in your job? And only 1 in 12 of that group said that they felt engaged in their work. So really important, because many, many business leaders think that socializing is a distraction, that it takes away from the bottom line. But it turns out that it works in just the opposite way. That when people feel more connected to each other at work, they want to show up for each other. They want to help each other out. They do better work. The bottom line benefits. The other thing the Gallup survey showed was that half of CEOs say they are lonely much of the day. So this is at all levels of organizations. So what do we do about this? How do we shift these trends? And so for this, I'm going to start with a quote from one of my Zen teachers, John Tarrant, who said something that I come back to a lot. He said, attention is the most basic form of love. That if you think about it, giving each other our undivided attention is the most valuable thing we've got to offer. It's also the most difficult thing to do now. My colleague Linda Stone writes about what she calls continuous partial attention, where we're kind of half looking at a screen and half listening or talking, right? We're not fully there. I train psychiatry residents, and I have to train them to turn away from their screens, to look at the patient, to talk to the patient. These are psychiatrists. These aren't even the orthopedic surgeons, right? And so there is tremendous pull away from giving each other our full attention. So what can we do about it? Well, the antidotes are pretty clear. We can really structure our lives to be different. We can structure time so that we have time with our partners, for example, with those people we come to take for granted, to have real date nights where there are no distractions. There are workplace meeting structures that can allow people to get to know each other more so that people learn about each other. Certainly, family dinners can be promoted. Many families don't know how important it is to eat together regularly, and very few families are eating together regularly in the United States. And when they come to understand how impactful it is, it lowers rates of teen pregnancy, teen substance abuse. It raises grade level, academic performance for kids when families eat together regularly. So all of this needs to be talked about and structured in family life. And then finally, doing what you're all doing tonight, coming to community events, and ideally volunteering in the community, that these things really matter for keeping us healthy, keeping us happy, keeping us feeling like we belong in the world. All right, so you're probably thinking, I have got so much going on in my life. How am I going to add anything? How am I going to add anything to do with relationships? So I want you to do something for me now. I want you to think about a person who's not here, who you don't see very much, or you don't see as often as you'd like, who you kind of miss, or you haven't been in touch with in a while. So get that person in mind. Take a minute. Okay. Now I want you to take out your phone. Go ahead, take them out. Now you can take out your phone. Okay. And now what I'd like you to do is just text that person or send them an email, whatever you're used to doing. And it could be anything. You could just say, hi, I was thinking of you. Or, hi, I'm listening to a speaker who made me text you. Or just anything that you would want to text to somebody who you'd like to be in a little more touch with. So take a minute to do that. So while people are finishing, let me explain, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because this is a tiny action. And this is the kind of action that actually can keep relationships more vibrant, right? So you could add this to your daily commute on the T. You could add this while you're waiting in line at the grocery store, right? You could, there are many ways we can add these kinds of little personal touches that don't require heavy lifting, don't require vast amounts of extra time, right? And the people in our study who were the best at relationships, it was before texting, but they were the people who called people on the phone, who stopped by someone's desk every day, who would drop little notes. So hopefully if we have some time for questions, and if anybody gets anything back and you're willing to share, I'd love to hear it. So, all right, so we're actually trying to take some of this information, this science, and put it into usable form. I mean, I've been publishing in journals, fancy academic journals that nobody reads, right? And so what we're trying to do is take this information and put it into usable form. We created a program called Roadmaps for Life Transitions, where we do a 5 5 small group sessions where people actually come together. Sometimes it's groups who know each other, sometimes it's groups who don't know each other yet, and they talk about their lives. They talk about where they are in their lives, what their most cherished values are, what's the state of their current relationships with people, and are there things they'd like to change? What are some transitions they're going through now? And what does science tell us about how to manage those transitions? I've just finished creating a course with Harvard Medical School to do similar kinds of things. So we're trying to put this into usable form for people. So just in case it isn't already clear, these messages are really simple, that human connection is a major source, not just of happiness, but of our physical health and of staying healthier as we age. That this kind of social fitness, the kind of thing you just did, texting somebody, that it is simple. It's the kind of thing we can build into our lives. It's the kind of thing we can teach our children and our grandchildren. And that we probably do need to be much more intentional, much more proactive in structuring our lives to combat isolation, because isolation seems to be the path of least resistance in our culture. And it's at our peril that we let ourselves just drift along in that direction. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you for all this attention. And I would be happy to entertain questions. If anybody heard anything back?
I did.
You did? Oh,
I got it right in like a second.
what'd you hear?
A person just responded, said it was really good to hear from you. Let's make plans soon.
Okay, so for those who didn't hear it, the person she texted said, it's really good to hear from you. Let's make plans, right? Okay, yeah.
Back to, I feel special. When can we walk?
That's great. Did you hear that? She said, I feel special. When can we walk? So these are small things, right? And they work. They don't work every time. Like some people won't text you back. Maybe they're having a bad day. But much more often than not, you're going to keep getting things back from people when you make this kind of effort. All right. So thank you for being willing to do this. Yeah. So questions, yeah.
I just texted my son, and he wrote back. This is hysterical. Hold on, where is it? This is your son Joel. Did you mean to send this?
Right. I love this. So just right. Are you sure you're my father? Right. I love that. Tell him that's one of the best responses I've ever heard. All right, any questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the connectedness of a text, for example, versus being in person or
call
or that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That question about what's the difference between being connected via text, for example, and being in person? I don't think we know yet. There's a lot of research going on because people often ask, for example, when I'm in a Zoom meeting, is that the same as being in person? And that's a little more connected than a text, but it's a similar issue. And I don't think we know yet. We know some things are filtered out through digital medium, right? And even on Zoom, like we see and hear each other, but remember back to the pandemic when you could only see people on Zoom. And then when we got together with each other again, there was this just upsurge of energy because we know how much got filtered out. And so I think scientists are trying to study what exactly gets filtered. Certain aspects of emotional communication get filtered, but I think the specifics are yet to be understood about that. But those connections really matter. They're not trivial, right? And that's what so it's not as though, what we do find is that when people use social media actively to connect with each other, they get happier. when they use it passively to scroll through other people's curated lives, they get less happy. And that's an important distinction. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on that. Zoom, I mean, there's negatives and positives to everything. And one of the great positives to Zoom is you can connect visually with people who aren't here. They could be in another state, they could be and yet you're not just on the phone with a voice, you're with them in person in a sense. So you get a chance to see more emotions, to more reaction, more. So there's a positive side.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's, that I'm glad you mentioned that, the positive side of Zoom or any video platform, because it really does make a difference to have those kinds of connections, particularly, think about it when you can't be with your kids or your grandkids, when you can't be with a friend who's halfway around the world. The other thing we know is that people who, for example, have unusual medical conditions or disabilities, they often, and there's nobody around them who's like them, when they can connect with other people who have similar situations, it is so impactful, even if they never meet those people in person. And so we know that there are real positive benefits to using the digital world to do this kind of connecting.
I want to continue with what Lois was saying. I agree with it, no question about it. But take a therapy session on Zoom. And we're talking about it with my daughter, about myself. I never really thought I could do it. And the person I'm talking to is definitively, I have his full attention. And we've been able to make some really great progress. So I didn't think it was going to happen on Zoom. But I was just thinking in that moment, if I was, every year I got to go into the office and say hello in person. If I was to go into that office, it'd be, and I can't put my finger on it, it would be a definitively different experience. And I can't put my finger on it. Yet I get so much out of the Zoom call for that hour every week that, there has been tremendous growth. There is something missing if I think about how would I feel if I went into his office. I can't put my finger on it.
I love that. I mean, I see patients in psychotherapy every day. And some of my patients come to my home office, and many of my patients are on Zoom. And it's different. And you're right, that if you had told me 5 years ago that you could do meaningful psychotherapy on a video platform, I would say you were out of your mind. But it's working, right? It's working for you. My colleagues and I are doing it. I'm sure many of you are either in therapy or therapists yourselves. So we don't, again, what this means is that the digital world isn't good or bad. It's how we use it, and that we have a lot more to understand about it. And that's really the key. Yeah.
I wonder, I can imagine you would know that people in the audience who are divorced are feeling very depressed with what you said about 5 to 12 years shorter lifetime. So I'm just saying, I wish that big brain of yours with some of your colleagues at Harvard would figure out some alternatives to online dating and bring older, smarter people together in real mixers where they really meet each other. Like they did in the 50s.
Yeah.
Like I wish
Absolutely.
I had
Absolutely.
courage to start this kind of business myself, because I know for a fact that what you're saying is true, and that loneliness will kill you faster than a lot of other things. But it's very hard. Especially when you haven't lived somewhere for 35 years. And I would say to every single person in here, when you say, text somebody on the phone, what I would say is be kind to people in your life that are alone.
Absolutely.
Be very kind. And when you're at a bar and you're a couple, talk to the person at the bar who's there alone.
Yeah.
Try to bring an alone person to have more fun or introduce them to somebody.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard at an older age.
Yes, it is. Also, I'm really glad is this still working? What happened? All right, anyway, I'm really glad you talked about this, because it's not about a marriage license. And what we find is that there are people who have very good friendships, who get all these health benefits. So you don't have to be partnered to get these. But you're also talking about something different, which is how hard it is to make new relationships as you get older. And when a marriage ends, that's a huge event in lives. And so you're absolutely right. And I think part of what we're trying to do is figure out how do we create situations where people more naturally meet each other and get connected. What I will say is that some of what they've studied is the easiest way to make friends. How do people make friends? And one of the things they show is that if you do something you care about or you enjoy and you do it alongside other people, you're more likely to strike up conversations because you have something in common. And that if you go back again and again and you see those people again and again, some of those conversations are more likely to deepen. It's like why we tell our kids, sign up for activities in high school, sign up for activities in college. It doesn't matter what they sign up for. It's just, yeah. But you're pointing to something so important, in all of our lives. Yeah.
So you were mentioning earlier about cell phone use and teenagers. So I sit on a school board locally, and last year we tried to outright ban cell phones at high school. 3 people come to our meetings as a general rule. Hundreds of teary-eyed parents. Okay. The kids were moderately okay with it. The parents went out of their ever life.
And can you say why? Why?
Without sounding like a school committee member, oh my God, I can't reach my son or daughter. What happens if blah, blah, blah happens? What happens if I stub my toe? What happens if I It was unbelievable.
Do you remember when we all went to school and there was no such thing as, right, and we all survived?
Right. You're also mentioning unintended consequences. There were some issues though, because we did outright ban them. But there were some kids who felt completely isolated by their peers. They didn't have a peer group.
Yeah.
So that was a challenge.
Yeah.
We ran.
Yeah.
Or they ran. Actually.
Yeah.
So it was really an interesting dynamic, but it was mostly.
It is interesting. But you're pointing to something that is this on again? Yep. You're pointing to something that I've wondered about, which is how much do we as parents get attached to this instant contact, right? That we ought to be able to live without. But we've also been trained, right, by these screens, by these phones. When, my parents, they didn't know what was happening to me all day long, and they could live with that just fine, right? But I think one of the things we haven't really come to terms with is how the screens and this instant contact has shaped parents' psyches as well around their kids. And I don't hear anybody writing about that, but I think you're seeing it on the school board. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, I want to know if you wake up with that smile on your face.
No. I'm gonna.
My real question is, one of the hot items in pediatrics over the past 25 years deals with ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. And I'm wondering if in your research you were able to tease out, are there just individuals who cannot necessarily achieve that happiness because of the template that they experienced when they were younger? Yeah.
I mean, we studied adverse childhood experiences, and what we found in our second generation was that 86% of our 1,300 kids had some significant adverse experience. So, and we included things like bullying, but that's such a huge question. Like, how much of childhood trauma can be overcome, and in what ways? There's no definitive answer to that. I mean, what we do know is that people really can be helped, usually by good relationships of various sorts, to overcome traumatic experiences. But none of it can completely be overcome in some cases, particularly the more severe cases. So I think, again, as you know, it sounds like you're in pediatrics. Is that right? Yeah. So, and as you know, there's so much variability in what happens to children, and then in their outcomes. And we're still not very good at understanding like which particular childhood events lead to which particular outcomes. Researchers have had a terrible time finding anything reliable in that regard. So it's a profound question. Nobody knows the answer. I know that in some cases, people have been able to overcome a great deal of childhood trauma, and in some cases, people remain impaired their whole lives. And we're not good at predicting who's going to be in which group. Two more questions? Yeah.
Yes, you said one of the groups you studied were the ones who lived in poverty, terrible family dynamics, and all that goes with it. But you said some children managed to lead the best life possible. Did your studies figure out what it was? I mean, maybe it was one sibling among 10. Did
Yeah.
figure out what that ingredient was that let them overcome it?
We did, but there's broader research on this. And actually, there's a good developmental psychologist, Michael Rutter, who's written a lot about this. And what he says is that, that there've been, so much research on child development. And what he said is, it all boils down to the idea that every child needs one consistent adult who's crazy about them. And if they have that, it doesn't matter who the adult is, right? It doesn't matter what their role is. They need a consistent person who just loves them and is looking out for their well-being. And that's the single factor that is the best predictor of which children are going to thrive, even if they have adverse experiences in childhood. Yeah. One more. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the people that went through, these periodic test, questionnaires, and they know every 2 years they're going to get a phone call or, some other outreach. And for some reason, I'm thinking more of the Harvard, the very tight, homogenous group. Do they come to expect that call, and does that change their behavior in anticipation of the test, or?
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for asking. So we've actually asked people, at one point we asked them to tell us, how has being in the study affected you? And if some people said it hasn't affected me, some people said your questions are a damn nuisance, but many, probably the majority of people said, I knew that you were going to ask me about my life, and it made me think about my life differently as I lived my life. So it's like, what we know is that when we observe something, the act of observing changes what we're observing. And so we are not a hands-off study. We never were. And we send them birthday cards. We send them thank you notes when they return questionnaires, right? So we are, in that sense, you could argue we are not a good scientific study. But on the other hand, only 22% of people have dropped out in 86 years. That's unheard of, because we've helped them feel like a community, and we're constantly thanking them for the gift that they're giving to science. So what you're pointing to is that it's a trade-off. We know we've affected them. We think mostly for the better, but we have influenced them, and that means it's not the purest science it could possibly be. They're not rats in mazes for us.
Can you just do that for everybody?
Everybody. Oh, you mean? Yeah. No, but they had, and for, we had, for the first probably 50 years, there were 2 women who were like the moms. They were the research assistants, but they essentially ran the study. And it was those women to whom people would come to when they needed to find a doctor, when they lost a job, when they needed a loan, and sometimes the study actually loaned people small amounts of money. And it was usually these women who held together the study community in that way. Yeah. All right, we should stop, right? Okay, yeah.